the night the music almost stopped. Harlem didn't sleep that night. It breathed, low and heavy, the kind of breathing a neighborhood makes when it knows something is wrong but hasn't yet said it out loud. Inside a dim basement beneath a shuttered storefront, 6 men sat around a wooden table scarred with cigarette burns and knife scratches. The single light bulb above them hummed faintly. Smoke gathered at the ceiling like a storm cloud. They weren't loud. That was what made it dangerous. They spoke in half-sentences and coded phrases, not about music, not about art, but about messages and examples, about who belonged where, about who had crossed invisible lines. Upstairs, Harlem was glowing, because the voice of Nat King Cole had been echoing through radios all week, silky, smooth, unbothered. And that, to some people, was the problem. Nat wasn't just singing love songs anymore. He was standing tall, performing in rooms where he had once been told he didn't belong, smiling without apology, succeeding without permission. That kind of grace unsettled small minds. Back in the basement, a folded newspaper sat on the table. On the front page, Nat, dressed sharp, head tilted toward a piano. One man tapped the picture. He thinks applause changes things. Silence followed. They weren't planning applause. They were planning intimidation. And in 1950s America, intimidation didn't require noise. Across Harlem, at Small's Paradise, the air was alive with jazz, laughter, clinking glasses, velvet curtains, and polished shoes. Near the back of the club stood a man who didn't laugh loudly, didn't drink heavily, didn't fidget. He simply watched. Bumpy Johnson was not a large man, not physically imposing in the way movies would later exaggerate, but Harlem shifted around him. He wore a dark suit tailored like armor, his fedora tilted just slightly, eyes calm, measuring. People said Bumpy could hear trouble before it spoke. That night, trouble whispered. A young messenger pushed through the club doors, breath short, eyes darting. He didn't approach Bumpy directly. He waited. That was the rule. Eventually, Bumpy turned his head without moving his body. The messenger leaned in and murmured something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Bumpy's face didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He asked one question. "Tonight?" The messenger nodded. Across town, basement, 6 men, plans. The music inside the club swelled, trumpet cutting through the smoke like sunlight. Bumpy adjusted his cufflinks. "Get the car." Meanwhile, in his hotel room, Nat King Cole sat at a piano near the window. Harlem lights flickered outside. He played softly, not for an audience, not for applause, for himself. His fingers moved like water across keys, but there was something in his posture, tension. Nat had lived long enough to know success did not guarantee safety. He had performed through protest, through insult, through rooms where smiles were forced and handshakes were reluctant. Still, he chose elegance, because he understood something powerful. Dignity unsettles hatred more than anger ever could. He paused mid-note. Something in the air felt tight, like a string pulled too far. He closed the piano lid gently. The car ride. Bumpy's car rolled through Harlem slow and steady. No sirens, no rush. 2 men sat with him, silent. He didn't believe in noise unless necessary. He believed in presence. He believed in walking into rooms and changing oxygen levels. As they drove, another name hung unspoken in the car: Joe Louis. Joe wasn't in Harlem that night, but his name carried weight everywhere. A heavyweight champion who had knocked down more than opponents. He had knocked down myths. Joe had once told Bumpy something after a fight. Strength isn't loud, it's certain. Bumpy carried that sentence like a pocket watch. He wasn't driving toward violence, he was driving toward certainty. The basement. The 6 men were mid-discussion when the footsteps sounded above, slow, measured. One of them looked up, another reached instinctively for the edge of the table. The basement door creaked open, heavy wood, long hinges, and then footsteps down the stairs. Not rushed, not angry, just deliberate. The bulb flickered as a shadow stretched across the wall. When Bumpy Johnson reached the bottom step, the room changed temperature. No one spoke. That was the first victory. He didn't sit, didn't remove his hat. He looked at the newspaper on the table, at Nat's photograph, then at the men. "I hear you've taken an interest in music." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. One man cleared his throat. "We're just talking." Bumpy stepped closer to the table, placed 2 fingers lightly on the newspaper. "Good." A pause. "Let's talk." What power really is. The men expected shouting, threats, posturing. Instead, Bumpy pulled a chair slowly and sat, crossed one leg over the other. "You see," he began calmly, "there are 2 kinds of strength." He glanced at the newspaper again. "One needs noise." Silence stretched tight. The other walks into a room and finds it already quiet. One of the 6 shifted uncomfortably. Another tried to hold eye contact, failed. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. "You can dislike a man's success." He tapped Nat's image gently. "But you don't get to decide whether he belongs in his own city." No one argued, because this wasn't debate, it was gravity. Upstairs, Harlem still breathed. The world outside didn't know what was happening in that basement, didn't know how close something ugly had come to becoming something irreversible. But sometimes history shifts quietly, not in gunfire, not in headlines, but in a room where hatred expected fear and found composure instead. Bumpy stood slowly, adjusted his coat. "We understand each other?" 6 heads nodded, not of admiration, of clarity. When he reached the stairs, he paused. "One more thing." He looked back. "The music plays tomorrow." Then he walked out, and no one followed. Across town, Nat returned to the piano later that night. He didn't know details. He didn't need to. He played again, and this time the notes felt steadier. Because sometimes protection doesn't announce itself. It simply removes the storm before it breaks. Outside, Harlem exhaled, and somewhere the silence of 6 men echoed louder than any threat ever could. When silence travels beyond Harlem. The morning after Bumpy walked out of that basement, Harlem did not erupt in celebration. There were no speeches, no headlines announcing that something dangerous had dissolved in the dark. That was not how real protection worked in those days. Real protection was invisible. It moved quietly, like wind slipping between buildings. But something had changed. The air felt steadier. The tension that had hovered like static electricity over the neighborhood softened, and the streets resumed their rhythm. Men opened shop doors. Women carried groceries. Children chased one another down sidewalks as if nothing had almost happened. Yet beneath the ordinary, a message had already begun to travel. The 6 men from that basement did not speak of what occurred. Pride would not allow it, but pride would also not allow them to test the certainty they had witnessed. They had expected confrontation. They had expected rage. Instead, they encountered composure sharpened into steel. When Bumpy Johnson entered that room, he didn't threaten them with chaos. He confronted them with consequence. And consequence is far more unsettling than anger. Anger can be dismissed. Consequence lingers. Word traveled without names attached. In barbershops, someone mentioned that certain ideas had been reconsidered. In back rooms of clubs, someone remarked that Harlem was not to be tested lightly. No one said Bumpy's name directly. They didn't need to. His presence functioned like a signature without ink. And as the message spread, something else spread with it. A reminder that success would not be hunted quietly in the shadows without resistance. Meanwhile, across town, Nat King Cole prepared for another performance. The theater lights would be brighter that night, the audience larger. His suit pressed crisp. But behind the polished surface, he carried the weight of living in 2 Americas at once. One America applauded his voice, requested encores, memorized his melodies. The other America watched him with narrowed eyes, unsettled by his refusal to shrink. Nat understood that talent alone did not shield a man. Grace did not guarantee safety.
Yet he also understood something profound. Retreat would not protect him either. If he retreated, he would surrender more than stages. He would surrender dignity. He paused backstage, listening to the murmur of the crowd. Applause before the curtain rose always sounded like rain against a roof, soft at first, then gathering force. His fingers flexed at his sides. He thought about the countless hours at the piano as a boy, about the discipline of practice, about the deliberate choice to remain composed when insult tried to provoke him. Every note he played was an answer to someone who believed he did not belong. He had learned long ago that excellence was not just art, it was resistance. That same evening, several hundred miles away, Joe Louis read a newspaper clipping in a quiet hotel room. Joe had long since become more.
The weight of being seen. By the time the story of that basement confrontation had faded into rumor, something more complex had begun unfolding beyond Harlem's borders. The immediate danger had dissolved, yes, but what replaced it was not simple peace. It was attention, and attention in America during that era could be just as volatile as hostility. When a black man succeeded publicly, especially with elegance and composure, he did not merely entertain, he unsettled the architecture of expectations that many had grown comfortable with. That was the invisible battlefield where Nat King Cole now stood. Nat had always understood the cost of visibility. As a young musician traveling across the country, he had learned to measure rooms quickly. He knew when applause was sincere and when it was reluctant. He knew when handshakes carried warmth and when they carried calculation. Yet, despite this awareness, he refused to alter his demeanor to make others comfortable. His calm was not passivity, it was discipline. It was the product of a mind that had decided long ago that rage would not be allowed to write his narrative. Still, even disciplined men feel weight. Letters began arriving at the theater. Some praised him for representing dignity under pressure. Others questioned his ambition to perform in spaces where he had not historically been welcomed. The letters that unsettled him most were not openly hostile. They were the ones that urged him to know his place. Those words carried centuries behind them. They were soft threats disguised as advice. Nat read them without outward reaction, folding them neatly and placing them aside. But at night, alone, he sometimes sat at the piano longer than usual, playing not for an audience, but for steadiness. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson observed the shift with calculated patience. He understood something many did not. When intimidation fails, resentment often grows more strategic. The 6 men in that basement had not been isolated anomalies. They were symptoms of a broader discomfort spreading in certain circles. Bumpy's protection had been decisive, but protection alone could not reshape a nation's prejudice. What it could do was buy time. Time for visibility to normalize. Time for success to become less shocking. Time for excellence to erode ignorance slowly. Bumpy believed in time as a weapon. He had used it throughout his life, allowing opponents to underestimate him until their misjudgment became irreversible. Joe Louis watched events unfold with his own quiet understanding. Joe Louis had long ago learned that when you defeat a man in the ring, you also confront what he symbolized. His victories had carried emotional consequences far beyond the boxing arena. Every punch thrown under the bright lights reverberated through communities who saw in him proof that imposed limits could be broken. Now, watching Nat navigate a different arena, Joe recognized the same dynamic. The ring had ropes and referees, the stage had curtains and critics, but both spaces demanded composure under scrutiny. When Joe arrived in Harlem as planned, his presence did not come with spectacle. There were no grand announcements. He attended Nat's performance as a patron, seated where he could observe without disrupting the rhythm of the evening. Yet those who recognized him understood the significance immediately. A champion in one domain had chosen to sit visibly in support of excellence in another. It was not solidarity expressed through slogans, it was solidarity expressed through presence. In a society accustomed to division, that image alone carried quiet force. The theater that night felt electric. Nat sensed it before the curtain rose. Something in the atmosphere was charged, not hostile, not celebratory, but aware. When he stepped onto the stage and approached the piano, he caught sight of Joe seated in the audience. Their eyes met briefly. There was no exaggerated nod, no dramatic acknowledgement, just recognition. It steadied him, because sometimes knowing you are not alone reshapes the air around you. He began to play. The notes were softer at first, deliberate and restrained. As the melody built, so did the room's focus. Nat's voice carried a depth that evening that even seasoned listeners noticed. It was not louder, it was grounded. There is a difference between performing and standing firm through performance. That night, he did both. The applause that followed felt less like entertainment appreciation and more like collective release, the kind that occurs when tension has hovered unspoken and is finally exhaled. Outside the theater, however, not everyone exhaled comfortably. Newspapers began covering Nat's expanding reach with a tone that oscillated between admiration and caution. Some articles praised his talent while subtly questioning his ambition to perform in spaces where he had not historically been welcomed. Others suggested that social sensitivities should be respected. The language was polite, the implications were not. Success was being tolerated but not fully embraced, and tolerance is a fragile foundation. Bumpy recognized the pattern immediately. He had lived his life navigating systems that tolerated his presence only when it suited them. He knew how quickly tolerance could shift to enforcement, yet he also knew that momentum, once built, is difficult to reverse without exposing injustice openly. That was the strategic turning point. If opposition acted aggressively against a man whose only weapon was music, it would reveal more about the opposition than about the artist. That awareness made many hesitate. Hesitation was leverage. In private conversations, Bumpy and Joe discussed the broader implications. Neither man romanticized the situation. They understood the stakes clearly. Visibility invites challenges, but invisibility invites erasure. The balance between those two realities defined the era. Joe remarked one evening that the hardest battles are often the ones without a bell to signal the start or end. Bumpy agreed. The conflict surrounding Nat was not a single event. It was a test of endurance. Could grace outlast hostility? Could composure withstand sustained pressure? Could excellence normalize itself over time? Nat himself wrestled with quieter doubts, not about his talent, but about cost. He had a family. He had responsibilities beyond applause. Each time he stepped onto a stage that some believed he did not belong on, he was making a choice that extended beyond career ambition. It was a statement about possibility, and statements carry consequence. There were evenings when fatigue settled heavily on his shoulders. In those moments, he returned to the piano not for rehearsal, but to remember why he began playing in the first place. Music preceded conflict. Music preceded politics. Music was pure before it was contested. Holding on to that truth anchored him. As weeks passed, the initial tension surrounding the basement incident transformed into something subtler but more powerful: normalization. Nat continued performing. Joe continued standing visibly where support mattered. Bumpy continued ensuring that intimidation found no foothold in Harlem. The lack of spectacle became the spectacle. Nothing exploded, nothing escalated. Instead, excellence persisted, and persistence can be revolutionary when expectations predict collapse. By the end of that season, a shift had occurred that could not be easily undone. The attempt to silence through fear had failed. The expectation of retreat had not materialized. The music still filled theaters. The applause still rose. And perhaps most importantly, the image of strength standing beside artistry had been etched into memory, not as a dramatic headline, but as lived reality. The weight of being seen had not vanished, it likely never would, but something fundamental had changed. The men who once believed they could dictate who belonged where had encountered a force they did not anticipate: disciplined unity, not loud, not reckless, but firm. And firmness, when sustained, reshapes landscapes slowly but permanently.
In the quiet aftermath, each man understood his role more clearly than before. Nat would continue playing, knowing that every note carried both beauty and defiance. Bumpy would continue watching, understanding that vigilance was not temporary but ongoing. Joe would continue embodying strength, recognizing that visibility is sometimes the greatest shield. Together, though rarely photographed in the same frame, they represented a convergence of talent, strategy, and resolve. History rarely marks the moments when disaster is prevented. It tends to record only the disasters themselves. Yet sometimes the more profound turning points are the ones where violence is avoided, dignity is maintained, and fear denied the final word. Part 3 was not about triumph, it was about endurance. And endurance, sustained long enough, becomes transformation. The night that became a memory. Time has a way of sanding down sharp edges, but it never truly erases the weight of certain nights. The basement incident did not explode into national headlines, nor did it end with dramatic public declarations. Instead, it settled into memory like a stone dropped into deep water, its ripples spreading quietly outward long after the surface appeared calm. What made that night powerful was not spectacle, but what did not happen. No stage was stormed, no violence erupted, no song was cut short. The music continued, and in that continuation lived something far greater than confrontation: permanence. For Nat King Cole, the weeks that followed marked a subtle shift in how he carried himself, though few would have noticed from the outside. His posture remained composed, his voice retained its velvet precision, his smile still arrived at the right moments, measured and warm. Yet beneath that polished exterior, something had crystallized.